At 1 Janvitst in the morning, my 8-year-old granddaughter slipped me a tablet while my daughter lay unconscious in the ICU. Mom said only Grandpa can see this. I pressed play. Seconds later, I knew her fall was no accident. What it appeared on that screen dragged me back into a world I had buried after 26 years undercover. My son-in-law and his powerful senator father had no idea who I really was or the trap I was about to build. When the reckoning came, my son-in-law woke beneath his own oak tree, zip-tied and terrified. Beside him was a note, "You touched the wrong family." The coffee had turned cold a good hour before that, but I left the mug right there on the table regardless. It was an old habit, something solid to wrap my hands around, while I worked my way through that endless stack of insurance files. They never got any shorter, those files, no matter how many late evenings I surrendered to them. My name is Leonard Hadley. I am 58 years old. I keep a 2-bedroom house in Brooklyn, New York, and I get around in a 2010 Ford Taurus that needs a new alternator belt. The neighbors have me figured for a quiet, unremarkable man, someone who pushes paper and risk assessment for a mid-size insurance firm in Midtown. That assessment is not entirely wrong. It is just nowhere near the whole truth. Welcome to Honor Revenge Stories. I'm glad you found your way here. If stories like this one speak to you, consider following along so you don't miss what's coming next. Before we go any further, I'd love to know, is this your first time sitting with one of these stories? Or have you been here a while? Drop a word in the comments and let me know. One quick note before we begin: some details in this story have been shaped for the audio experience, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is coincidental. What's real is the heart of it. That's what matters. Mrs. Kowalczyk next door once informed her daughter that I was the dullest man on the street, and she said it like a kind thing. She was not entirely mistaken. She simply lacked the full picture. For 26 years, from age 29 to 55, I carried a badge no one ever saw, working undercover for the New York Police Department. Those years put me inside organizations that had no legal existence, money-moving operations that crossed international lines, groups that erased inconvenient people, outfits that thrived in the blind spot between what law enforcement could prove and what it could not touch. Different names, different faces, different lives. I cycled through them the way most men cycle through work shirts. I constructed whole identities from the ground up, then abandoned them when the job was over, or when it became clear the job would never be over, which happened more than I have ever admitted to anyone. My exit came 11 months shy of the full pension. The department read it as exhaustion. They were wrong. It was arithmetic. Audra had just hit 29 and was building her life out in Los Angeles, and I had given too many years to being the kind of man who could not be found when his family needed him. 14 minutes away, or 14 hours, I had made my choice. So I settled in, softened the edges, and became the dullest man on the block. For 3 years, that arrangement had held. The call came at 9:47 on a Friday night in September. The display lit up Ronald Reagan UCLA Medical Center area code, 310 Los Angeles. I was no stranger to bad news. 26 years in deep cover meant I had fielded calls that rewrote everything. Operations blown wide open, sources exposed, and burned colleagues who turned out to be something other than what they had claimed. I understood at a cellular level what it meant to lift a phone and know before the second word that something had broken beyond repair. This call was in a category of its own. Mr. Hadley said the voice measured female, the practiced calm of someone who delivered these notifications on a nightly basis. "This is Dr. Adaize Osei calling from Ronald Reagan UCLA Medical Center in Los Angeles. I am calling regarding your daughter Audra Fenner. She has been brought in following an injury and is currently in emergency surgery. Sir, I need you to listen carefully. The situation is serious." My right hand locked around the edge of the kitchen table until my knuckles went white, but I kept my voice level. 26 years of conditioning does not dissolve overnight. "What kind of injury?" I asked. "A traumatic head injury, Mr. Hadley. She is in surgery right now. I cannot provide additional details over the phone, but I strongly urge you to travel to Los Angeles as soon as you are able." I put 2 more questions to her. I committed the answers to memory, no notepad required. Then I thanked Dr. Osei and ended the call. For exactly 4 seconds, I stood at the kitchen counter with a dark phone in my hand and my pulse hammering so hard against my sternum, I could feel it in my teeth. My eyes stung. My throat closed down until each swallow felt like forcing something sharp past a knot. Audra, my daughter. 26 years of staying invisible, of being the unremarkable man in Brooklyn, all of it in service of keeping her insulated from the wreckage of my former life, of ensuring that not one of the people I had helped put away could ever draw a line between Leonard Hadley, the insurance consultant, and Leonard Hadley, the man who had helped pull apart 4 of their operations. And here she was, on a table somewhere in Los Angeles, while I stood in my kitchen with my hands shaking and no way to reach her. I slid the phone into my pocket, lifted my keys off the hook beside the door, and left. Whether I'd locked up behind me never crossed my mind. I didn't go back to check. Heading toward JFK, I dialed Beatrice Audra's mother, my ex-wife of 11 years, the one person who had more right to this information than anyone. She answered on the second ring. "Leonard, it's almost 10 Uhr. Beatrice!" My voice came out rough, something fraying at its edges that I had not intended. "I need you to listen to me. Audra is at Ronald Reagan UCLA Medical Center in Los Angeles. She's in surgery, head injury. I don't have the full picture yet. The noise Beatrice made then was unlike anything I had heard from her in all our years together. Not across 14 years of marriage or the 11 that followed. It started as a sharp-pulled breath and collapsed into a sob she tried to contain, and couldn't grief surfacing from somewhere too deep to manage, too raw to hold back, too frightened to stay quiet. "Oh God," she choked out. "Oh God, Leonard, get on a flight." I told her I was already on the way, and I kept my voice even steadier than it had any business being steadier than she could manage, because the truth was that my hands were shaking against the steering wheel and I was pushing 90 miles an hour on the Van Wyck Expressway, and there was a blur at the edge of my vision that had nothing to do with traffic. "Get on the first flight you can. I'll be there before you. I'll call you when I land." "Is she going to be okay?" Beatrice asked, and her voice came apart on the final word, hollowed out, and frightened something so small in it that it pressed the air straight out of my lungs. "I don't know yet," I said. "I don't know." There was nothing else I could honestly offer. Not about this. I reached JFK in 31 minutes. The last open seat on an 11:15 flight to LAX was mine, a middle seat between an elderly woman reading a paperback and a teenager with headphones. 5 hours and 20 minutes. No sleep. No food when the flight attendant came around. Just the gray fabric of the seat back ahead of me and the long, dark stretch of the country passing underneath. 26 years had sent me into rooms with no map and no certainty rooms in Antwerp and Chicago. A warehouse on the outskirts of Baltimore where 3 men who intended to kill me believed without question that I was someone else. The rooms had never frightened me. Somewhere along the way I had learned to park the fear outside and retrieve it afterward once the work was done. But at 35,000 feet above the American heartland, I could not locate that skill. I had never entered a room where my daughter was the one on the table. I had no procedure for that, no training that covered it. I was not certain any version of me could manage it at all. I pressed 2 fingers against my closed eyes and held them there until the burning eased. Then I set both hands flat on my legs and let them rest. I breathed. I waited for the descent. The entrance to the emergency department at Ronald Reagan UCLA Medical Center carried that specific smell, antiseptic layered over recycled air. And the overhead fluorescents did what hospital fluorescents always do, flood everything with a brightness that reveals too much and strips what little warmth remains. I came through those doors at 12:37 in the morning, still wearing what I'd had on, when the phone rang back in Brooklyn. Carry on one shoulder. Something behind my eyes that felt like ground glass after 3 hours of not sleeping. I picked out Gavin before he noticed me, posted near the far wall of the waiting room, alongside a man I had never seen in person. Tall, silver hair. The straight-backed posture of someone accustomed to being the most consequential figure in any room he entered. This man had a hand resting on Gavin's shoulder and was speaking close to his ear with the measured quiet of someone performing comfort while keeping his own composure intact. On the flight, I had pulled up Senator Clifton Fenner of California, 22 years, in the State Senate 3 committee chairmanships, a photograph on his official website that showed a man who had learned to smile in a way that reached his eyes just enough to seem genuine. Standing there next to my son-in-law, he was recognizably that same man, only older and less successful at concealing the calculation behind his expression. Gavin turned and found me across the room. He came toward me with his arms already spreading, his eyes red-rimmed, voice fracturing as he said, "Leonard, thank God. We've been so worried." He moved to embrace me, and I let it run exactly 2 seconds before I pulled back and met his eyes straight on. Tell me what happened, I said. Gavin released a long, trembling exhale that wore the costume of grief. She fell, he said. God, Leonard, it happened so fast. We were at home. She was coming down the main staircase and her foot slipped. Or maybe she missed a step. I don't know exactly. I wasn't right there. I heard the sound and I ran in and she was at the bottom and she wasn't. His voice gave out. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth. She wasn't moving. Senator Fenner stepped forward and extended his hand. Leonard Clifton Fenner, I am so deeply sorry about Audra. She is a remarkable young woman, and our entire family is devastated. His grip was firm and dry and perfectly calibrated. The handshake of a man who had pressed 10,000 palms and knew precisely how hard to squeeze for each occasion. Thank you, I said. 26 years of listening to people tell me things that weren't true leaves a mark on you. Not anything dramatic, nothing close to supernatural, just the slow accumulation of thousands of hours spent watching for small signals. The fractional pause before a particular word. A sentence carrying one detail more than it needs. The answer that arrives a half-beat quicker than genuine memory would allow. Gavin's account of the fall had 3 of those signals in the first 90 seconds. He'd said he wasn't right there when it happened, yet he had described the sound with a precision that didn't fit someone who ran in afterward. That kind of detail belongs to someone who was already nearby when it occurred. He'd also volunteered the staircase specifics carpeted dropping 4 steps into the sunken living room before I asked where it happened. And when I put the question about Audra's phone to him, his jaw went tight for just a fraction of a second before the concern resettled across his face like a curtain being drawn back into place. Her phone, he said. She might have had it in her hand when she fell. It could be broken. I don't know, Leonard. I wasn't thinking about her phone. I was thinking about her. Of course, I said. You're right. I'm sorry. Senator Fenner touched my arm. Leonard, I want you to know that whatever Audra needs, whatever either of you needs, this family will see to it. We don't walk away from our own in a crisis. Whatever the medical costs come to whatever the recovery demands, we will be there. He said it with warmth. He said it the way a man says something he has every intention of meaning, and the part of me forged across 26 years in rooms with people who said precisely that kind of thing, registered it the way a seismograph registers a tremor. Nothing loud, nothing dramatic, just a needle ticking a fraction to the left of where it had rested. Before I could answer, Dr. Adiz Osei came through the double doors at the far end of the room. She was 44 years old and moved with the clipped efficiency of someone who had been on her feet for 11 hours and was nowhere near finished. She located my face in the waiting area, the way doctors do, by finding the person whose expression hadn't shifted since they walked in. Mr. Hadley, she said, I'm Dr. Osei. I performed the surgery on your daughter tonight. Audra came through the procedure. She has a subdural hematoma bleeding between the brain and the skull, which we were able to address. She's in the ICU now, in a medically induced coma, to give her brain the rest it needs and allow the swelling to come down. The next 72 hours are critical. My chest compressed in that particular way it does when news is not the worst possible, but is still a long way from good. I heard Beatrice make a sound beside me. She had come in while Gavin was talking, eyes swollen, coat still buttoned, face raw, and now she pressed both hands over her mouth, her shoulders shaking with the effort of not coming apart entirely in the middle of the waiting room. Can I see her? Beatrice asked, her voice barely reaching above a whisper, thick with everything she was holding back. In a little while, Dr. Osei said gently, Let me take you to a family room first. Gavin and Senator Fenner moved to follow. Dr. Osei glanced at them, then at me, and something crossed her face. Not suspicion, exactly, more like a quiet decision being reached. Mr. Hadley, she said, could I have a word with you privately for just a moment? Senator Fenner's eyes went to her face and stayed there 1 second longer than they should have. Of course, I said. She led me to a small consultation room off the main corridor, 2 chairs, a box of tissues on the table, nothing else. She pulled the door closed. Then she drew a tablet from her coat pocket and held it where I could see the screen without her surrendering it from her hand. I am required under California Penal Code 1160 to notify law enforcement when the account given by accompanying individuals does not appear consistent with the physical findings. She said, I want you to know I filed that report at 11:00 tonight before you arrived, before anyone from the family had spoken to me about the circumstances. I looked at the screen. The image showed Audra's injuries in clinical detail, the site of the head trauma, and a bruise pattern on her right wrist, running in 2 parallel lines across the inner joint. The kind of lines that come from fingers closing hard enough to mark. My stomach dropped 6 inches. My throat tightened and went dry, and I had to pull a slow breath through my nose to keep my face where it needed to stay. The wrist, I said. Yes, Dr. Osei said, and the location of the head injury is inconsistent with a fall down carpeted stairs of the height and angle described. The force required to produce this specific fracture pattern would typically result from contact with a harder, less forgiving surface. She paused. I have documented everything. The photographs are time-stamped to the hospital server. Automatic upload cannot be retroactively altered. I looked up from the tablet. Who controls the timestamp? The device or the server? Dr. Ozzy studied me for a moment with an expression I couldn't quite place. The server, she said. Automatic upload. The timestamp is assigned at the point of upload, not at the point of capture. Thank you, I said. For filing the report. For telling me. She gave one short nod. Mr. Hadley, I don't know what took place in that house tonight, but I know what I found on that table. She held my gaze. Your daughter fought very hard to stay here. I walked back out into the corridor. Beatrice was against the wall, arms wrapped tight around herself, face crumpled and wet, no longer making any attempt to hold it together, whispering something under her breath that may have been a prayer. I put my arm around her, and she came into me and cried against my shoulder, her whole body shaking. I held her and looked straight ahead at the double doors leading to the ICU, where my daughter was lying in a bed, breathing through a machine. Senator Fenner was watching me from across the waiting room, with the expression of a man trying to read a document written in a language he mostly knew. I gave him nothing to read. Beatrice finally released my arm around 1:00 in the morning, when a nurse appeared to tell us Audra had been moved to the ICU, and that we could look in on her briefly 2 at a time, 5 minutes, no exceptions. Beatrice went in first with Gavin, and I stayed in the waiting room with Senator Fenner and a cup of coffee from a hallway machine that tasted like it had been brewed sometime during the previous administration. The room had thinned out over the last hour. 2 other families remained: a young man asleep across 3 chairs with a jacket pulled over his face, and an elderly woman working a rosary with her eyes shut. The overhead lights hummed at a frequency that found the space behind your eyes after a while and settled in. Senator Fenner took the seat across from me. He was in no hurry. He had the patience of a man who had learned that people who fill silence tend to hand you things you can use. I did not fill the silence. I drank the bad coffee and I waited. Leonard, he said, at last leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, voice low and unhurried, the register he probably reached for at constituent meetings, when someone arrived with a problem that needed managing. I want to speak to you plainly, man to man. What happened tonight was a terrible accident. Audra is strong. She is going to pull through this. And when she does, our family is going to make absolutely sure she has everything she needs to recover fully. That's generous. I said. It's not generosity, he said. It's family. He let the words sit a moment. I know this has been a shock. I know you are frightened for your daughter. That is completely understandable. But I also know that fear can sometimes push people toward decisions that create more problems than they solve, bringing in outside parties making accusations before we have a complete picture. He held my gaze. I would hate to see a painful situation become unnecessarily complicated. I looked at him over the rim of the coffee cup. He was good. 22 years in California, politics had taught him to deliver a threat in the exact same register as a kindness, so you were never quite certain which one you had just received. I appreciate you sharing that, I said. He studied my face for a moment, searching for something, anger, fear, some flicker of comprehension he could work with. I gave him a pleasant, tired look, and nothing beyond that. I'll think about what you've said, I told him. He nodded slowly, satisfied enough, and settled back. He believed he had made his point. He believed he was looking at a frightened father from Brooklyn, who now grasped that the room was considerably larger than he had assumed, and the people occupying it far more powerful than he was equipped to deal with. He thought the conversation had concluded. It was only getting started. I got up to fetch another cup of coffee, not because I wanted any, but because I needed to move, needed 30 seconds away from that man's line of sight. And when I came back around the corner by the vending alcove, I stopped. Cora was standing next to my chair. Beatrice had called Audra's neighbor a woman named Connie who kept a key to the Hancock Park house and occasionally watched Cora on short notice, and Connie had driven her to the hospital once the call came through. That was the kind of arrangement Audra made quietly, the way she handled everything. Cora was 8 years old and small for her age, with Audra's dark eyes and the particular serious look children wear when they have been told something important is happening but haven't been told exactly what. She had on pajamas with small white rabbits on them, and sneakers someone had put on her feet in a hurry, left shoe on the right foot. A small backpack sat on both shoulders, the cartoon character kind she probably carried to school, and she was gripping both straps so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. My granddaughter. The last time I had seen her was 6 weeks ago, when I made the drive down from Brooklyn for her birthday. She had insisted I eat 2 pieces of cake and informed me with great seriousness that her favorite dinosaur was the Triceratops, because it had 3 horns. Now she was standing in a hospital waiting room at 1:00 in the morning, shoes on the wrong feet, jaw set, with a kind of determination that pressed against my chest so sharply I had to breathe through it. I crossed the room and crouched in front of her so we were level. "Oh, hey, bug," I said quietly. Her chin wobbled at once, her eyes filling up enormous dark brimming, but she pressed her lips together and held it the way a child holds it when they have decided that crying is not permitted yet because there is something they need to do first. "Grandpa," she said barely above a whisper, "I have something for you." She let go of one strap, reached around to the front pocket with careful, deliberate hands and unzipped it slowly. She reached in and brought out a tablet, an older model. The screen cracked at one corner, the case a faded olive green. She held it out with both hands the way you offer something that matters and cannot be dropped. "Mommy said, only give this to Grandpa," Cora said. She said, "Don't give it to anybody else." She said, "Especially." She stopped, swallowed. Her voice fell even lower. She said, "Especially not Daddy." The weight of that sentence hit the center of my chest and spread outward like something coming apart. My hands were steady when I took the tablet, years of training muscle memory that doesn't ask for permission. But beneath that steadiness, my heart was going hard, and my throat had closed in a way that had nothing to do with composure and everything to do with the fact that my daughter had known. She had seen it coming, and the last thing she had done before it arrived was make sure her 8-year-old remembered one instruction: only Grandpa. I looked at Cora carefully. "Did anyone see you take this out?" I asked. She shook her head. "Mommy put it in my bag herself at home. Before." Her chin wobbled again, harder this time, and one tear broke loose down her left cheek. She swiped it away furiously with the back of her hand. "Did you tell anyone you had it?" "Anyone at all? No." She said it with the absolute certainty of a child who has been entrusted with something important and has not let it slip. "Mommy said just you." I put my hand on her shoulder. "You did exactly right," I told her. "You did perfectly, Cora. I'm so proud of you." That was when she broke. The sob came out of her like something that had been contained for hours, raw and ragged and carrying the specific terror of a child who doesn't understand what is happening, but understands that it is very bad. She pitched forward and I caught her, and she pressed her face against my neck and cried with every part of her body, small shoulders, heaving fingers locked onto the back of my jacket, hard enough that I could feel her knuckles through the fabric. I held her and let her cry. I pressed my hand against the back of her head and looked across the waiting room at Senator Fenner, who sat watching us with an expression of practiced sympathy that stopped well short of his eyes. After a few minutes, Beatrice came back from the ICU, her face-wrecked eyes red and nearly swollen shut, moving like someone whose footing had just been taken from under them. She stopped when she saw Cora in my arms and made a sound that was equal parts relief and fresh grief, then came across and wrapped herself around both of us. "I've got her," I told Beatrice quietly. "Take her for a few minutes. I need some air." Beatrice nodded and drew Cora gently away, murmuring into the little girl's hair. I slipped the tablet into the inside pocket of my jacket, felt its weight settle against my ribs, and walked out through the automatic doors into the Los Angeles night. The air was warm and carried exhaust fumes and a faint hint of ocean somewhere past it all. I stood in the ambulance bay with my hand pressed flat against the tablet through my jacket and looked up at the sky, that particular orange-gray that belongs to cities that never go fully dark. Audra had put the tablet in Cora's bag. Before everything came apart, she had already understood that it might. She had already worked out a plan. She had already decided who to trust. She had thought of me. I took out my phone and reserved a room at a motel in Koreatown, cash anonymous, nothing tied to my name that anyone watching would turn up on a first pass. Then I went back inside and sat with Beatrice and Cora until the little girl finally fell asleep across 2 chairs, with her head in Beatrice's lap, and I waited until the clock read 2:53 before I stood and said, "I need to step out for a while." Beatrice looked up at me, eyes raw and hollowed, and asked, "Where are you going?" "To find out what happened to our daughter," I said. She held my gaze for a long moment, then gave one nod and looked back down at Cora's sleeping face. I walked out into the night with a tablet in my jacket and 26 years of knowing how to disappear. I drove toward Koreatown and did not look back. The motel on Hoover Street in Koreatown was the kind of establishment that asked no questions if you paid in cash, which I did 2 nights, $71 a room on the 3rd floor at the end of the corridor away from the vending machines. The carpet was the color of something that had once been forest green. The air conditioner rattled when it cycled, and the bathroom light took 4 seconds to come up to full brightness. It was perfect. I sat on the edge of the bed, set the tablet on my knee, and opened the folder marked Evidence Do Not Delete. There was one video file. Audra had named it Gav Fenner Room SEO5 MP4. 4 minutes and 12 seconds. I pressed play. The footage was shaky shot, through a door left open maybe 2 inches. The camera angles slightly downward the way a phone is held when someone is trying to keep it still without bracing it on anything solid. The room beyond the door was well lit, wood-paneled, the kind of room that exists in houses where the interior design cost more than most people make in a year. A long table was visible, and stacked across it were documents, manila folders, and what appeared to be a laptop with an external drive connected to it. Gavin had his back mostly turned to the camera, one hand moving towards something spread across the table. Whatever he was saying came through too quietly to follow. I caught pieces only, numbers, account names, something about a schedule or a window. Across from him stood 2 men. The first was built heavy somewhere in his mid-40s, gray hair cut close to the skull, a scar tracing the line from his left jaw up toward the ear. The second was thinner and younger by roughly 10 years, with the contained deliberate stillness of a man who had long since made a habit of not announcing himself in any room. First pass, I let it run straight through. Second pass, I stopped it. At the 27-second mark, the camera wobbled slightly and the angle opened up, pulling the heavy-set man's face into the window light. My gut dropped. That face was not new to me, not from any file or photograph, but from 14 months of field work in 2014, the better part of a year and a half, feeding a case against a financial network that routed money through layered shell companies so deliberately tangled that a 6-analyst team needed 8 months just to chart the first 3 tiers. The man with the scar and the close-cropped gray was Holt Drucker Mesa, Arizona American-born, who had devoted 20 years to becoming one of the most capable money movement operators on the West Coast. 14 months under our watch. We never got close to proving who sat above him and issued the orders. I moved forward to the 41-second mark and froze on the lean man's face. Bo Kellum out of Houston, Texas, originally had served 2 years in federal corrections in 2008 on a wire fraud count that turned out in retrospect to be the most minor item on his ledger. He had run alongside Drucker as the operational piece for at least 6 years before my retirement, probably more. I put the tablet down on the mattress and stood. 3 paces was all the room allowed before I hit the window. I drew the curtain back an inch and looked down at Hoover Street, deserted, a traffic light below, running through its sequence for an empty intersection. Across the way, a convenience store still burning its lights. 14 months I had spent trying to identify whoever sat at the summit of that network. The figure supplying the political insulation, the financial credibility, the kind of high-level cover that causes federal cases to stall and quietly die. The investigation was shut down in March of 2015. Insufficient evidence, the file said. I submitted retirement paperwork 11 months after that. The person at the top had been Clifton Fenner. His son had been managing the ground-level operations. And my daughter had pushed open a door 2 inches no more and captured 4 minutes and 12 seconds of footage that stitched it all together. After that, she had gone to her daughter's room and made a backup copy. And after that, she had gone down a staircase in a way that I refused flatly and completely to believe was an accident. I pressed a closed fist against the window frame and kept it there until the knuckle turned white. My teeth were clamped down hard enough that I could feel the tension reaching into my jaw. The anger was present. It was entirely present-focused, hot landing on a specific target. But anger couldn't be allowed to drive anything right now. I had put it in a box before, and I did it again. Decisions made from rage don't hold. I returned to the bed and pulled up the subfolder labeled unsent. A single draft addressed to my number, time-stamped 4:51 p.m. on September 5th, composed hours before the surgery call came. Hours before Ronald Reagan UCLA Medical Center lit up my phone. Hours before the world shifted. Dad, I need to talk to you. I found something. Can you call me tonight? 7 words and a question, typed and never sent. Maybe she had meant to call directly. Maybe time ran out before she could. What it meant either way, she had seen enough to be frightened she had turned toward me, and she hadn't been able to reach me before it happened. Something behind my eyes burned. My chest felt hollowed and wrung dry. I sat on the edge of that motel bed in Koreatown and read the message 4 times over and gave myself exactly 90 seconds to feel the full weight of it pressing down. Then I went down to the car, in the lot, pulled out the prepaid phone from under the seat where it always lived, and carried it back upstairs. That phone had ridden under that seat since my last day on the job. Pure habit. Audra had never been aware of it, neither had Beatrice. I dialed a number that had sat untouched for 3 years. 2 rings, then a voice relaxed, unhurried, not a trace of sleep in it, because Clyde Burnett had spent 23 years learning to sleep like a cat lightly, and with one ear always open. "Yeah," Clyde said. "It's Leonard. 2 seconds of quiet. How bad? I said I need you in LA tonight if you can make it." "Is this about Audra?" I looked at the frozen image on the tablet, Gavin's back to the lens, the spread of documents on the table, 2 faces I had spent 14 months working to move into a courtroom. "Yes," I said. "And there's more to it beyond that. I'll lay it out when you're here." A shorter silence this time. "I'll be there by 6, Clyde said, and the line went dead. I rested the prepaid phone on the nightstand, lifted the tablet, and worked through the final 3 minutes of footage. Gavin talking, gesturing the 2 men across from him, responding with nods. 4 minutes and 12 seconds drawing a straight line from a 14-month investigation to a California state senator to the man responsible for putting my daughter into a medically induced coma so she couldn't finish a phone call. I had arrived in Los Angeles as her father. Nothing about that had changed, but I was also something else, and whatever that something else was had just taken a precise measurement of the room it now occupied. Unverified footage with no documented chain of custody would be torn apart before any jury ever saw it. What I needed first was corroboration, financial records, ownership trails, a second independent witness before anything went to anyone. 8 days of careful construction produces a case that survives. 1 sleepless night produces a motion to dismiss. I clicked off the screen, stretched out on the bed, fully dressed, and watched the ceiling until the dark strip beneath the curtain softened from black into gray. By 5:30, I was back at Ronald Reagan UCLA Medical Center, carrying gas station coffee from a place on Wilshire, and a clean shirt I had bought from a 24-hour CVS 2 blocks from the motel. The shirt was rigid and carried the smell of its own packaging. I did not mind in the least. Audra's ICU room was on the 4th floor. The nurse at the desk informed me that visiting didn't open until 8. Then she looked at my face, the coffee, the shirt, with the CVS tag still hanging from the collar, and said 5 minutes and sent me down the hall with a nod. I stood in the doorway of my daughter's room for those 5 minutes, and I did not cross the threshold. Everything was visible from where I stood, the machines, the tubes, the profound stillness of a body laboring at something no one on the outside could see. Her face had gone slack and pale the way a face does when the person behind it is no longer present in any ordinary sense. She looked younger than 31. She looked the way I remembered her at 9 years old, out cold on the couch in front of the television, and I would gather her up and carry her down the hall to bed. That memory arrived somewhere behind my breastbone, with enough force that my hand locked around the doorframe, and I felt the edge of it pressing into my palm. I walked back to the waiting room, found a chair, and took the tablet out of my jacket. I opened a financial document unrelated to any of this. A quarterly review I owed a client back in Brooklyn, and read from it in a low, even voice because I needed occupation for my hands and my mouth, and the portion of my mind not currently devoted to the task of remaining functional. A night nurse named Odette went past twice and gave me the look of someone who had encountered stranger sights in hospital waiting rooms, and had long since stopped questioning them. Gavin walked in at 9:00. He was showered and buttoned into a pressed shirt, his eyes carrying a redness that might have been grief or might have been the kind of night that produces neither sleep nor anything resembling it. He asked whether I was managing. He asked if I'd had anything to eat. He offered again to find me a better place to stay. "I'm good here," I told him, "but I appreciate it, Gavin." He gave a nod. His eyes dropped to the tablet I was holding, screen side in the financial document still pulled up on it. He let his gaze rest on it a full second past what was natural. Then he glanced away and mentioned something about coffee. I watched him disappear around the corner and sat with that one extra second. At 11:00, I made my way down to the third level of the parking structure and spotted Clyde Burnett propped against a dark blue rental sedan in the second row, working through an apple with one hand and his phone in the other. 55 years old, and he carried it like 50 compact and capable, the body of a man who had spent the better part of his career in circumstances where going soft wasn't a viable option. 2 years ahead of me out of the department, he had turned a warehouse space in Chatsworth into a lean private investigations outfit. 3 people on the payroll, no online presence, the sort of shop that survives entirely on word, passed between people who required results handled discreetly and without error. His hair had gone nearly silver since our last meeting. He held himself with that brand of quietness you see in certain men after enough years in the work, not inertia, but something more calculated like a system conserving its resources until the moment full output becomes necessary. He caught my approach by sound and looked up. "You look terrible," he said. "I've been awake since 9:47 yesterday morning," I told him. "That accounts for the shirt." He came off the car and put out his hand. When I shook it, he held the grip firm and let it run a beat past a standard handshake. "How is she even alive?" "Induced coma," I said. 72 hours critical." Clyde's mouth pressed into a line. Over the years, he had crossed paths with Audra exactly 4 times dinners here and there during the stretch when Beatrice and I were still married. He had mailed her a card the week she completed her CPA program, which was precisely the sort of gesture that would have surprised anyone who only knew him through his work. One sharp nod. "All right, walk me through it." We didn't move from that parking structure for 20 minutes. I laid out everything: the injury pattern, Dr. Osei, the tablet, the video, Drucker, Kellum, the unsent message. Clyde stood there and took it in without a word. He finished the apple to nothing and kept the core in his fist because there was no bin nearby and he wasn't the sort of person who left things on the ground. When I wrapped up, he said, "Drucker and Kellum." "Yes." "We had them for 14 months. "Yes." A beat of silence. He rolled the core slowly between his fingers. Then, "You think the senator was running it?" "I think Senator Fenner's name is sitting on documents somewhere, paper that ties him directly to those 2 men, and to 300 million cycling through shell companies over 6 years. Clyde watched me without blinking. "You want that paper? I want all of it." "Done properly," I told him. "Only what holds up?" He flipped the apple core into a trash can 6 feet off without so much as glancing at it. "I'll need to get into the financial data from the video. Resolution probably won't be ideal, but partial account numbers give me something to work with as long as the frames hold." He paused. "One more thing, I need actual coffee, not that." He tilted his chin toward the gas station cup in my hand. "There's a spot on Vermont," I said. "Naturally, we're in Koreatown." He grabbed his bag out of the rental's back seat. "I'll get squared away at the motel, head back up there and play the worried father." "I am the worried father," I said. He held my look. "I know that," he said, and there was a weight in his voice that wasn't usually there. "I know Leonard." We split at the stairwell entrance. He went down. I went up. On the 4th floor, I found Beatrice in the waiting room. Cora stretched out asleep across her lap, the same way she'd been before. The child's shoes were finally on the right feet. Her face in sleep was so unguarded it put a catch in my throat all over again. Beatrice raised her eyes when I lowered myself into the seat beside her. She wasn't crying anymore. She had moved somewhere beyond the immediate break of it, into a grief that had settled in and made itself comfortable. The kind that doesn't leave in a day. "Did you manage any sleep?" she asked. "Some." I said, not a complete lie. Maybe 40 minutes on the motel bed before my eyes gave up the pretense. "Leonard." She said my name the way she used to, back when we were married, and something needed my full attention. Not just the surface of it. What happened to our daughter? I kept my eyes on Cora's face. Her hand lay loose beneath her chin, fingers half open. She had placed total faith in me, delivered something her mother had called important, then gone to sleep, certain I'd take care of it. The weight of that surpassed anything the tablet carried. I'm working on it, I told Beatrice. That's not an answer. It's what I've got right now. I held her gaze. Give me a few days. Can you do that? She read my face for a long moment, hunting for something solid, certainty, reassurance, any signal that I was further along than I was letting on. What I gave her was the honest version I knew enough to be moving, and not yet enough to be certain of where I'd land. A few days, she said at last, her voice pinched and reluctant. And then, you tell me what's actually happening. Yes, I said. She nodded. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and something moved through her expression. Something she got under control fast, but not fast enough. What is it? I asked. Number I don't know, she said. They want to know whether I have any of Audra's paperwork at home, claiming they're from her insurance company. She met my eyes. I never gave anyone this number, Leonard. Something cold locked in behind my sternum. I reached out and took Beatrice's phone from her hand and read the message. No carrier, no policy reference, just a carefully worded question about documents shaped to sound official without pinning anything down. Don't answer this, I said. Don't engage with anyone who reaches out about Audra phone call, text someone at the door. No one. Beatrice's eyes widened. Leonard, trust me on this, I said, and returned her phone and got to my feet. I have to make a call. I went to the far end of the hall, brought out the prepaid, and dialed Clyde. First ring. Set up already. What do you have? They reached out to Beatrice, I said. Unknown number, text message asking about documents. They're trying to establish what I'm sitting on. I heard Clyde's typing cut off. They haven't found the tablet, he said. If they had, they wouldn't need to ask. That's right, I said. Which tells me Gavin still believes the evidence is somewhere in the cloud. Silence for a moment. I ran in the account activity on Audra's main email this morning. 2 years back, she added me as emergency account contact when she configured her backup authentication. Last night, between 11:00 p.m. and 1:00 a.m., someone tried to reset her password 3 times. Every attempt was stopped by two-factor authentication. The verification codes were routed to her phone, which they no longer have. Two-factor authentication sends a one-time numeric code to a designated device, in this case Audra's personal cell phone, anytime an access attempt comes from an unfamiliar device or location. Without that code, the reset fails completely. Gavin had smashed Audra's phone, believing he was severing her access to her own accounts. What he failed to see was that he'd simultaneously cut off his own path in. He's chasing the wrong trail entirely, I said. Completely wrong, Clyde said. He doesn't even know the backup is there. I stood at that end of the corridor with the prepaid pressed to my ear, the hospital's ordinary sounds washing around me, monitors wheeled cart voices at the nurse's station, laughing over something utterly removed from any of this. And it landed on me, then fully for the first time, the complete picture of what my daughter had managed to do. She hadn't simply copied the evidence. She had moved it onto a device nobody would think to search for, put it in the hands of someone nobody would think to question, and left a message pointing to the one person she trusted to act on it, all within whatever window of minutes she had before Gavin walked through that door. She had gotten it right. Every part of it exactly right. Stay on the financial analysis, I told Clyde. I'll be in touch tonight. Leonard, he said just before I pulled the phone away. Yeah, she's going to be okay. It wasn't a medical opinion. Clyde had no basis for saying it, but there are things you say out loud because they need to exist in the air, provable or not. I held on to it for a beat before I responded. Yeah, I said. She is. Gerald Paxton showed up at 10 Sunday morning, carrying a leather portfolio, the color of dark charcoal, and the expression of a man who had already mentally cleared his afternoon. 51 years old, silver at the temples, radiating the kind of tailored self-assurance that comes from 22 years of making problems disappear before they could become headlines. He introduced himself with a firm handshake and a business card listing 3 different office addresses, which told me everything I needed to know about how seriously the Fenner family was treating this particular Sunday morning. Beatrice was next to me. She drew herself up when she saw him approach her jaw, setting her hand finding my arm. Mr. Hadley Paxton said, folding himself into the chair across from us, with the unhurried ease of a man operating on familiar ground. I want to begin by saying how profoundly sorry the Fenner family is about Audra. This has been a devastating time for everyone involved. He opened the portfolio, I'm here because Senator Fenner and Gavin want to ensure that Audra receives absolutely everything necessary for a full recovery. Whatever the costs amount to the surgery, the ICU, the rehabilitation, they intend to cover it without reservation. No ceiling, no strings attached. Beatrice's grip on my arm tightened until I could feel each finger separately. That's very generous of them, I said. It's family, Paxton said, and I could hear Senator Fenner's exact phrasing sitting in his mouth like something memorized. He slid a document across the low table between us, 15 pages clean, formatting the kind of paperwork that reads as simple until you actually go through it. This is a mutual non-disclosure agreement standard language. The family is asking that you refrain from making public statements about the circumstances of Audra's injury and that you not initiate contact with media outlets. In exchange, all medical expenses and Audra's rehabilitation costs are covered in full. Beatrice leaned forward, her voice sharp, the words coming raw. You're asking us to stay quiet about what happened to my daughter. Mrs. Hadley, Paxton said, his tone smoothing over it. This agreement simply prevents a painful family matter from turning into a public spectacle. It protects Audra's privacy as much as it protects anyone else's. Beatrice's eyes filled. Not the soft kind of tears, the hot, furious kind, the kind that arrive when grief swings around the bend into anger. Her privacy. She said it again, voice fraying at the edges. She is lying in that room right now, with tubes in her, and you're here talking to me about privacy. Beatrice, I laid my hand over hers. She stopped, but her whole body was rigid with the effort of holding it together, her breathing coming in short, uneven pulls. I picked up the document and read it. All 15 pages. Paxton waited with the patience of someone who had run this play before and understood that people come around eventually. I worked through every clause, every defined term, every scoped limitation. On page 5, I found what I was looking for, or more precisely confirmed that what I was looking for wasn't there. The agreement prohibited public statements. It prohibited initiating media contact. It required Leonard Hadley to refrain from making representations about the Fenner family to third parties. It said nothing about cooperating with federal investigators. It said nothing about responding to a grand jury subpoena. It said nothing about voluntarily providing information to the FBI or the IRS. In American law, no private NDA can lawfully bar a person from participating in a federal investigation. The moment a contract tries to obstruct federal process, it becomes unenforceable and potentially criminal on its own terms. Paxton had drafted this document to muzzle a grieving father in the press. He had not drafted it to halt a federal inquiry, because halting a federal inquiry through a civil contract is simply not something that can be done. He had handed me a key cut for the wrong lock entirely. I signed it, all 15 pages, handed it back across the table. Paxton's shoulders eased down half an inch. His smile was genuine, satisfied, the smile of a man who had wrapped up a problem well before lunch. Thank you, Leonard. I know this isn't easy. The family will be grateful, I said. He shook my hand, gave Beatrice a nod, and walked out with his dark charcoal portfolio and his 3 office addresses and his complete certainty that he had just put the matter to rest. Beatrice turned to face me the instant he cleared the doorway. Her eyes still wet, her voice barely reined in. Why did you sign that, Leonard? Why did you just sign that? I watched Paxton move around the corners toward the elevators. Then I looked back at her. Because it doesn't say what he believes it says, I told her. Not even close. She stared at me. Something moved across her face, confusion fading into something older. Something rooted in the 14 years she had spent, married to a man whose work she was never entirely permitted to understand. What are you going to do? She asked. I got to my feet and picked up my jacket. The right thing? I said. The slow way. The only way it sticks. Clyde called at 2 in the afternoon, while I was sitting in the hospital cafeteria, eating a sandwich I couldn't taste and staring at a news article I wasn't absorbing. I need you to drive to Long Beach, he said. Bring the tablet. I was in the car inside 4 minutes. He was waiting in a parking lot off Pier A at the Port of Long Beach, perched on the hood of his rental, with a paper coffee cup and a map folded down into quarters. The port spread out at his back, cranes the height of apartment buildings, container ships stacked 6 stories in boxes of every color, the particular industrial smell of salt water, cut with diesel and hot metal. Even on a Sunday, the place was alive. Ports don't stop. Walk me through it, I said. Clyde shook the map open. He had circled one location in red ink. Berth 217 Terminal B. Pacific Meridian Logistics, he said. Delaware registered 2018, single shareholder, listed as a holding company in Nevada. That Nevada company has one director, a man named Wendell Quimby, 73 years old, living in Tucson, Arizona, who has over the past 11 years served as registered director on 46 different companies across 9 states without any evidence of having actually done anything for any of them. Nominee director, I said. Someone paid to let their name sit on paper and never ask questions. A standard tool for burying real ownership. Correct, Clyde said. I traced Pacific Meridian back through 4 layers. The beneficial owner, the actual person or entity holding real control, is a holding company called Meridian Capital Partners, LLC. Meridian Capital Partners was formed in Delaware in 2017. Its registered agent is a Wilmington firm that handles incorporation work for 200 companies. But the EIN filing lists a management address in Sacramento, California. He met my eyes. Same zip code as Senator Fenner's district office. I looked out toward the berth. A white container ship rode low against the water, 2 cranes working it in slow mechanical rhythm. Pacific Meridian Logistics painted along the hull in blue letters. Cash transit, I said. That's what it looks like, Clyde said. Wire transfers leave electronic records that can be subpoenaed. Physical currency routed through a cargo operation is much harder to follow, especially when the manifests show legitimate freight, which they do. Pacific Meridian files clean manifests, textiles mostly, industrial equipment. Clyde folded the map back up. But the ship runs 8 trips a year on a route that doesn't hold together economically for the cargo it claims to carry. The margins only work if something else is moving alongside it. I stood there looking at that ship for a long moment. $340 million, 6 years, 11 companies, 1 vessel filing clean paperwork on routes that didn't pencil out, and a senator's management address sitting in Sacramento. There's something else, Clyde said. His tone had shifted not sharply, just a degree or 2 cooler. The register he used when he was about to deliver something I wasn't going to want to hear. The detective who caught Audra's case, he said, LAPD Wilshire Division, Paloma Garza, 9 years on the force. She filed the intake report based on Dr. Osie's referral Friday night. The case was marked active as of Saturday morning, was I said. As of Saturday morning, a city councilman named Roy Cheswick called the captain of Wilshire Division. Cheswick sits on the city's budget committee. He has influence over department funding allocations and personnel decisions, not command authority, but the kind of relationship where a phone call gets answered fast. Clyde held my gaze. 2 hours after that call, Detective Garza was brought into her captain's office and told the case needed to be handled carefully. The file was reclassified from active investigation to pending review. The cold settled back into my chest, the same cold that had been there since Beatrice showed me that text about documents. Not surprise, just the confirmation of something I had already suspected. Cheswick is tied to Fenner. Campaign finance records are public in California, I said. Clyde said Fenner Capital donated $42,000 to Cheswick's last 3 campaigns. Legal limit every time, clean on paper. He paused. The phone call was not clean. I turned away from the ship and took in the parking lot. The afternoon sun struck the concrete at an angle that bleached everything out slightly. A family went by. 2 parents, 3 kids, the youngest, insisting on being carried. Sunday at the port. Ordinary life unfolding 600 feet from evidence of $340 million in fraud. This detective, I said Paloma Garza, is she the kind of person who would notice what happened to her case? Clyde thought about it. Her record is clean. No complaints, 2 commendations made, detective in 7 years, which is ahead of the curve. She got the initial intake report in within 2 hours of Dr. Osie's referral, which tells you she moved on it fast when it was still hers to move on. He picked up his coffee cup. Someone who jumps on a Friday night report like that and then watches the file get reclassified on a Saturday morning? Yeah, she noticed. Then she's someone I need to talk to. Carefully, Clyde said. She has no idea you exist. And if it gets back to the wrong people that you're approaching department personnel, it hands Cheswick something to work with. I know how to approach someone without being obvious about it, I said. Clyde gave me the look he reserved for moments when he felt I was saying something too self-evident to require saying, which across 23 years of working together had been more times than I could count. I know you do, he said. I'm saying it anyway. We stayed there another minute watching the ship. The cranes held their slow rhythm, lifting and setting, lifting and setting. The port doing what ports do, indifferent to whatever was moving inside those containers. Leonard, Clyde said quietly. Yeah. $340 million over 6 years. He wasn't asking anything. He was doing what he sometimes did, speaking a number aloud to make it real, to make sure neither of us was holding it at arm's length. That's not a side operation. That's infrastructure. Something somebody constructed deliberately and shielded carefully over a long stretch of time. I know, I said. Which means the people behind it aren't going to stop at a text message to Beatrice. I looked at the ship one final time. Pacific Meridian Logistics clean, manifests routes that didn't add up. No, I said, they're not. I drove back to the hospital. The SUV that had been on me since Saturday held 2 cars back the whole way. I picked up flowers from a stand at the corner of Wilshire and San Vicente, yellow ones Audra's favorite since she was 7 years old, and carried them up to the 4th floor and set them on the table beside her bed, and sat down and started reading aloud from a quarterly report in my flat, unhurried voice. The SUV was in the hospital parking structure when I came out 4 hours later. Same spot, same 2 men. Good, I thought. Stay right there. I waited in the parking lot of LAPD Wilshire Division for 2 hours and 14 minutes on Monday morning before Paloma Garza came out alone. The intake report had listed her as P. Garza, and that was how I had tracked her down. She was 39 years old and moved like someone who had figured out early that looking unhurried was its own kind of authority. Dark hair pulled back, plain clothes, dark slacks, gray jacket with the particular alertness of a person whose work required her to read every room before she fully stepped into it. She was heading toward a gray Chevy Impala 3 rows over when I moved into her path at a distance that was close enough to be deliberate and far enough not to be threatening. Detective Garza, I said. My name is Leonard Hadley. Audra Fenner is my daughter. She stopped. Her right hand moved not toward her weapon, but to her side, the practiced stillness of someone cycling through options. She held my gaze for 3 full seconds before she said anything. How did you find me? She asked. You filed the intake report Friday night. I said, your name is on the document. She studied my face. Mr. Hadley, if you have concerns about your daughter's case, the appropriate channel is... Someone called your captain Saturday morning, I said. 2 hours later, your case moved from active to pending review. I'm asking whether you're the kind of detective who noticed that. Something shifted behind her eyes, quick controlled, but there. She had noticed. She had absolutely noticed. I held out my badge. NYPD retired in a plain envelope. 26 years undercover. I'm not here to create problems for you. I'm here because my daughter is lying in a medically induced coma, and the people responsible have enough reach to make a police report vanish over a weekend. She took the envelope but didn't open it. What's in here? 3 pages, summary only, enough to understand what you're dealing with. She looked at the envelope, then at my badge, then at my face, the careful, calibrated assessment of someone who had spent 9 years reading people in interrogation rooms. I need to verify who you are before this conversation goes any further, she said. Her voice was flat and professional, offering nothing. I don't accept packages from strangers in parking lots, Mr. Hadley, even ones carrying retired badges. I know, I said. Take 48 hours run. My name go through what's in the envelope on your own time. On your own time, not in that building. I nodded toward the division. Then decide. She held the envelope at her side. And if you decide this isn't something you want, any part of you won't hear from me again, I said. But I think you already know something is off with that case. I think you knew it before I showed up. Her jaw pulled tight a fraction, barely there. She was skilled at keeping her face neutral, but not quite skilled enough to conceal that one. I'll be in touch, she said, and walked to her car. I drove back to Ronald Reagan UCLA Medical Center. Upstairs, Audra's numbers were stable. The attending physician used the word encouraging, which in ICU language means things have not gotten worse, which is its own form of good news. I sat next to her bed and held her hand and felt how still she was, how the machines surrounding her were performing the work her body was supposed to do on its own, and my throat closed down until I had to breathe through it deliberately. I found them, I told her quietly. Both of them, the ones from the room. I moved my thumb across her knuckles, careful barely making contact, the way you handle something you are afraid to break. You did everything right, Audra. You did it exactly right, I just need a little more time. Her hand stayed still. The monitors held their steady rhythm. Afternoon light came through the window blinds in long parallel lines laid out across the floor. I stayed until visiting hours were done. Then I drove to Koreatown, checked in with Clyde, and slept for the first time in 3 days with my phone on the pillow next to me, waiting for a detective to run my name and land somewhere. The SUV had been with me since Saturday. Black California plates, 2 men up front who rotated shifts but never rotated far enough away that I stopped seeing the same vehicle at the same intervals in my mirrors. Monday night, leaving the hospital at 10 Borer, I decided to have a conversation with them without saying a word. I didn't go to Koreatown. I went west on Sunset, then south on Laurel Canyon, then east on Fountain, a route that made no geographic sense for anyone heading to a motel in Koreatown, which was precisely the point. The SUV made every turn without hesitation, which told me they had been briefed on my rental car's description and plate, and not much else. They were watchers, not operators. Someone had sent them to establish what I had and who I was talking to. I pulled into a Korean barbecue place on Vermont Avenue, went inside and ordered the bibimbap and a glass of water, and sat at a table facing the window. The SUV parked half a block north. Neither man got out. I ate slowly. I checked my phone. I looked like a worn-out man having dinner by himself, which was not entirely a performance. From the restroom, I called Clyde. "Black SUV Vermont, just north of Olympic," I said. "2 men been on me since Saturday, registered to a private security firm. I need the ownership chain." "Give me 20 minutes, Clyde said, and ended the call. I finished my food, paid a cash, drove back to the Koreatown motel at a completely unremarkable speed. With the SUV behind me, the whole way walked upstairs and called Clyde from the room. "Arden Security Solutions," he said. "LLC registered in Nevada, 2020. What comes next is where the weight of this whole story shifts. I had been moving carefully, patiently, but what I was about to confirm would show me exactly how deep the betrayal ran and how many people had been protected by silence. Tell me this. If you discovered someone close to you had been quietly working against your family, would you move in silence or would you confront them head on? The vehicle's primary client of record, Fenner Capital. Both men are contracted, licensed, nothing flagged in their backgrounds. Clean. A pause. Their job isn't to harm you, Leonard. It's to figure out what you're sitting on. So Gavin still hasn't connected the tablet, I said. Right? A man who knew would act, not observe. Clyde's voice carried no inflection, flat and certain as concrete. His read on you is a rattled father who may have turned something up online. He's gathering information before he commits to a direction. I was on the edge of the motel. Bed curtain pulled the glow from the parking lot, pushing in around the fabric. "Fine," I said. "Rattled is what I'll give him. Leonard, every morning I'll bring flowers to the hospital. I'll eat in the cafeteria and work through the newspaper. I'll ring Beatrice at 7:00 p.m., the way a man with nothing to hide does it." The curtain held my attention. The surveillance team files its report. Worried father, no meaningful movement, nothing worth escalating. Gavin backs off. A man who backs off gets sloppy. Clyde let a moment pass. "How long do you need?" 10 days, I said. "Probably less." "Clyde, I need you to close out the financial analysis, full ownership structure on Pacific Meridian, everything tied down with documentation and sourcing before any of it moves." 4 days, he said. 3, I said. The exhale he gave back was the sound of a man redoing the math. 3 days. You're covering the coffee." Something almost reached my face. Not quite. Then Clyde shifted the tone, dropping a register the way it did when the next thing wasn't going to be easy. "Gavin ran the security camera footage from the Hancock Park house tonight. I caught the access request through a service that monitors his activity. The pull was logged, a pause with actual weight in it. The footage he retrieved covered the hallway outside Cora's room. According to the timestamp, Audra stepped into that room 4 minutes before she went over. My jaw set. My hands stopped moving flat against my knees. "He knows," I said. "He suspects," Clyde said. "He can confirm Audra was in that room. What she did while she was there that he doesn't have. He'll be turning his attention toward Cora next." What passed through me at that wasn't fear exactly. It was something colder and more precise, the recognition that the people across from me were prepared to aim themselves at a child if that's what it took. "Cora doesn't leave Beatrice's side," I said. "Beatrice goes nowhere by herself. And Clyde, that little girl, does not get approached by anyone. Not anyone." "Clear," Clyde said. I ended the call and sat in the stillness of that room for a long stretch, the air conditioner rattling its complaint. Then I got horizontal on top of the bedspread shoes, still on eyes on the ceiling, and held in my mind the image of a small girl in pajamas with small white rabbits on them, offering me a tablet with both her hands. I made a promise to myself there in the dark, one I had every intention of keeping. Out in the lot, the SUV sat exactly where I'd calculated it would be. Good, I thought. Let them watch me. Every eye fixed on me is an eye not aimed at Cora. Leonard thought he was the only target. He was wrong. Someone else's name had already been placed on paper, without her knowledge, without her agreement, and turned into a weapon pointed at him. Clyde laid a single page on the table in front of me at 7:45 Tuesday morning. No preamble. He put it down, moved back, and gave me room to read. A summary printout. 3 columns, 11 rows. Each line carrying a company name, a registration state, and a contact person. I went through the list. Delaware, Nevada, California, Delaware again, Nevada again. Then 4th row from the bottom, Beatrice Hadley, Brooklyn, New York. I went through it a second time. Then I flattened the page with my palm and turned to face the wall. Walk me through it, I said. Steady voice. I noticed that about myself and was grateful for it. Clyde drew up a chair. Gavin pulled Beatrice's social security number and home address and used them to establish bank accounts beneath 3 of the 11 LLCs. Delaware permits formation with no direct signature from the beneficial owner. Registered agents handle the mechanics routinely, but a working business bank account requires a social security number and a name attached to a real person. He took hers. Clyde maintained his clinical register, measured factual the way he always did when the material hit close. Those accounts absorbed wire transfers totaling roughly $41 million across 4 years. Each time the money cycled through inside 48 hours and cleared before a quarterly reporting window could capture it. She had no knowledge of any of it. None, I said. The registered agent never reached out to her. The bank never reached out. Nobody connected to any of those LLCs ever made contact. No mail went to her address. She never put pen to paper. Her identity was deployed like an instrument, lifted used, returned to the drawer. I got up and crossed to the window. Down on the Koreatown street, the Tuesday morning was doing what Tuesday mornings do. A woman moving a stroller along the sidewalk, a delivery truck wedged in at the curb, 2 men outside a restaurant locked in some animated disagreement I couldn't hear through the glass. Beatrice had constructed 30 years of her life at a complete remove from any of this. She'd brought Audra up, returned to school at 42, and finished her degree, grown a modest bookkeeping practice from a spare room in a Brooklyn apartment. Meticulous, careful, honest, the particular honesty of a person who came up lean and grasped what it cost to keep a clean name. And while all of that was happening, someone had reached over, plucked her name off the shelf, and run $41 million through 3 accounts she didn't know were open. I unclenched my hands deliberately. Identity theft, I said. Federal Statute 18 U.S.C. Section 1028. Clyde confirmed it. Aggravated given its commission alongside another federal felony, wire fraud. Mandatory minimum 2 years stacked on top of whatever sentence the underlying charges carry. Then he paused. But Leonard, Beatrice's legal exposure is real. DOJ hasn't confirmed she had no knowledge. Until they do, her name is attached to those accounts. If any of this surfaces publicly before we've established she's clean, she lands in the frame as a person of interest, which is precisely the outcome he engineered. I said he wants grounds to pick up the phone and tell me, put your signature on something. Keep your mouth shut or your ex-wife goes down next to my son. Yes, Clyde said. That's the architecture. I dialed Beatrice at 800. She answered on the second ring. Her voice had that particular calibrated brightness, the sound of someone who has been awake for hours and is working to project steadiness. How is Audra this morning? First words out of her mouth. Stable, I said. Beatrice, I need your full attention right now. Don't accept legal counsel from anyone Gavin or Senator Fenner points you toward. Don't put your name on anything they send. Don't speak about Audra's situation with anyone but me. Silence. Then, Leonard, what is happening? Soon, I said. Right now, I need you to trust me. No, she said, and her voice fractured at the seams, fear and exhaustion, and something edged with anger all arriving at once. Don't come back to me with trust without giving me something to hold on to first. I am in this hospital, watching my daughter breathe through a machine. People are texting me about her paperwork. And now you're on the phone at 8 in the morning, telling me to stay away from lawyers. Her breath broke. Give me something real. I shut my eyes. She was right to push. She had always been owed more than I managed to give. Your name appears on financial documents connected to Gavin's business. I told her, documents you never signed, never knew about. You did nothing wrong, and you are not in jeopardy. But I need days, not hours, to make that demonstrable before questions start arriving. The quiet that came after was different in texture from before, heavier, longer. My name, she said, yes. On his paperwork, yes. I listened to her release a long, shaking breath that had 3 days of fear and grief, and no sleep packed inside it. When her voice returned, it was quieter, controlled, in the manner of someone who has concluded that coming apart right now is a cost she can't afford. How long have you known this? Since this morning, I said, and you're taking care of it, not a question. That was the tone 14 years of being married to a man who resolved things she wasn't permitted to know about, and a hard-won accommodation with that reality that never stopped costing her something she didn't have a name for. Yes, I said. A pause. Then, handle it, Leonard. I will, I said. She ended the call before I did. I stood in that Koreatown room, phone in hand, her name on a page on the table, the street below, moving forward the way streets do, regardless. And I thought about the anger that doesn't burn, the kind that turns cold instead, that drops into the chest like iron ballast, sets itself down and doesn't move. Heavy, permanent, of use. Gavin had used Beatrice the way he used everything as an instrument, as leverage, something to be taken off the shelf, applied, and set back down. Using her that way had been a mistake, not a tactical one, a personal one. 4 rows from the bottom, I said to Clyde. He looked at the page. Yes. Every document we send to the FBI needs a dedicated section establishing her non-involvement, dated, sourced, airtight. Already building it, Clyde said. I folded the paper once and put it in my jacket pocket. Then I went to sit with my daughter, and on the way I stopped at the flower stand on Wilshire and bought yellow ones and carried them upstairs and set them beside yesterday's, which were already beginning to open. The call reached me at 7:52 Wednesday morning. I was in the hospital cafeteria with bad coffee and a direct line of sight to the parking structure. I had the levels memorized by then, knew which one the SUV favored. Unknown number, Los Angeles area code. Mr. Hadley, Paloma Garza said. I pulled your record. I know, I said. A pause, not hesitation, more like someone adjusting their footing. 26 years NYPD, retired 2018, you check out. Another pause, shorter. Can we find somewhere to talk that isn't a parking lot? We met at a coffee shop on Fountain Avenue in Silver Lake, a small place with mismatched chairs, a chalkboard menu, and enough background noise that a corner table conversation stayed private without trying. Paloma was already seated when I got there, back to the walleyes on the door. That told me everything I needed about how she reads a room. I took the chair across from her. She had a flat white and my 3-page envelope spread open on the table, the pages marked up in pencil handwriting so tight and methodical it looked like evidence notation, which I realized was exactly what it was. You went through it, I said. 3 times she said. The financial summary is thin, you're not giving me sources. Not yet, I said. What I needed first was to find out whether you'd still be in this chair on Wednesday after what happened to your case on Saturday. She held my gaze. Her jaw was set. Her eyes carried the particular exhaustion of someone who had not slept properly in several nights and had chosen to channel that into something harder than fatigue. My captain told me the Fenner family wanted the matter handled sensitively. She repeated the word sensitively, the way you repeat something that left a bad taste. Direct quote. I have been doing this job for 9 years, Mr. Hadley. I know what sensitive means when it comes down from a captain who fielded a call from a city councilman 2 days after I submitted my intake report. What does it mean, I asked. It means make it go away, she said. I don't do that. She pressed a finger to the top page of the summary. Dr. Osie's injury documentation is solid. The pattern doesn't fit the stated mechanism. I knew that Friday night. What I was missing was anything that tied the inconsistency to intention. She set the page down. Your summary points to financial evidence. Organized fraud. That's federal jurisdiction. Yes, I said. So why bring this to me, rather than walking it directly to the FBI? I leaned forward a degree. Because the federal case depends on the state assault charge holding. If Gavin Fenner gets convicted on financial crimes, while Audra's case gets quietly shelved at the county level, he serves reduced time in a federal facility and walks out in 8 years. What he did to my daughter needs a detective who won't let it evaporate, and it needs physical evidence that made it through whatever he did to her phone. Paloma went quiet. She rotated her flat white in a slow circle on the table, a thinking gesture, not a conscious one. Then, "There's something you need to hear." Her voice had moved still professional, but with something underneath it that had clearly been sitting with her for a while. 3 years ago, she said, a woman named Sandra Whitver filed a report at Wilshire Division. 29 years old, event planner, assault complaint against Gavin Fenner following an incident at a private event in Malibu. She watched my face. The complaint was detailed and specific, and the physical evidence Dr. Osie's report would look very familiar alongside. My chest pulled tight. I kept my expression where it needed to be. What happened to it, I asked, though I already understood the shape of the answer. Sandra Whitver withdrew it 14 days after filing, Paloma said. She'd brought on a private attorney, one she couldn't have paid for herself. The complaint was formally withdrawn. She relocated to Seattle, Washington within the month. Paloma lifted her flat white and held it without drinking. I wasn't the detective on that case. I came across it 2 years ago while running background on something unrelated. The name Fenner surfaced in a search. The file closed marked insufficient evidence. It isn't insufficient evidence, she said, setting the cup down. It's a paid settlement wearing the clothes of a withdrawal. The anger that moved through me was the cold kind, the variety I had learned over years to recognize and put to use rather than simply feel. I pressed it down into the place I kept things that needed to wait. Audra isn't the first, I said. No, Paloma said. She isn't. I looked at the annotated pages laid out between us. 3 years. Sandra Whitver had taken what was offered and gone to Seattle and carried that withdrawal with her like a stone in a coat pocket. She'd done it because she had no other path, and nobody standing beside her, and no way of knowing that 3 years on, a woman named Audra would slip through a door, left 2 inches open, and hold a phone over a table. Is she willing to talk? I asked. I don't know yet, Paloma said. I haven't reached out. I wanted to understand what I was stepping into before I asked someone else to step into it with me. She met my eyes directly. Mr. Hadley, I became a detective because files don't disappear on my watch. That's not a speech. It's just what's true. Her voice was flat and certain, someone stating a condition of their existence rather than making a pledge. Get me something I can use and I'll use it. You'll have something by end of week, I said. She nodded, collected the 3 pages, folded them over once, and slid them into her jacket pocket. Then she stood, picked up her flat white, and drained it in one motion, a woman running against a schedule. One more thing, she said, pausing at the table's edge. The man who called my captain. Her eyes were steady and direct. Roy Cheswick, Budget Committee, he has sway over department funding. A beat. He also attended a fundraiser at the Fenner Estate in Hancock Park 14 months ago. There are photographs public record because the event was logged as a campaign finance disclosure. She held my gaze for a moment. I'm mentioning it because you strike me as someone who knows what to do with useful information. She left. I sat with my cold coffee and studied the 3 empty chairs around the table and thought about Sandra Whitver in Seattle with a stone in her pocket, and about Audra on the 4th floor of Ronald Reagan UCLA Medical Center with machines managing her breathing, and about the specific arithmetic of a man who had done this before and been permitted to do it again because the right people made the right calls at the right moment. Not this time. I took out the prepaid and called Clyde. Find Sandra Whitver in Seattle, I said. Current address, employer, phone number. Don't make contact, just locate her. And pulled the campaign finance records for the Fenner Estate fundraiser in Hancock Park 14 months ago. Full guest list. Give me 2 hours, Clyde said. You have one, I said, and ended the call. Out on Fountain Avenue, a city bus rolled by, carrying an advertisement on its side for a personal injury firm, a smiling attorney pointing at the camera above the words, "We fight for you." The morning light had the particular flat quality of a Los Angeles September that hadn't committed yet to being hot or merely warm. I left $4 on the table for a coffee I hadn't ordered and walked out into it. Senator Clifton Fenner's district office in Sacramento occupied the 4th floor of a building on L Street, with a view of the Capitol Dome and a receptionist who greeted visitors with the practiced warmth of someone whose entire job was to make every person feel expected. 3 hours up the 5 that morning, the Central Valley spread out on either side, nothing but flat brown earth as far as you could see. That kind of road doesn't give your eyes anything to do. It gives your mind everything. The device I was carrying was compact, clipped inside my jacket, voice activated, designed to catch speech at normal conversational range without needing the other person close. 11 years in the field, I'd relied on units like it. California runs on two-party consent under state penal law. Federal statute 18 U.S.C. section 2511 subsection 2d I operates differently. It governs situations where the intent is to expose and report federal criminal conduct for federal prosecution. I was a participant in this conversation. The objective was federal criminal activity. Senator Fenner let me sit in that anteroom for 9 minutes, enough of a wait to register, as deliberate, not long enough to call it anything but chance. Then an aide guided me through a hallway lined with framed photographs, the senator clasping hands with people of consequence one after another. Beyond that was the office dark wood paneling California state flag in the corner, the dense quiet of a space that had swallowed 22 years of closed-door agreements. He was on his feet when I stepped in, moving toward me with an outstretched hand. The handshake was firm and unhurried. His expression said concern. His voice found exactly the pitch of a man who had rehearsed sincerity long enough that it no longer felt like rehearsal. "Leonard," he said, "thank you for making the trip. I know things have been extraordinarily hard. How is Audra holding up as stable?" I said, "I appreciate you asking." He pointed me to the chair opposite his desk and lowered himself into his own seat with the ease of someone who has never felt out of place behind a desk that size. He didn't go to the subject. He asked how the drive had been, whether I'd found somewhere comfortable in Los Angeles, whether the staff at the hospital had been responsive. The questions came with what looked like real attentiveness, and likely was in the sense that attentiveness and tactical patience aren't mutually exclusive in a man who has long since mastered both. After roughly 4 minutes of that, he shifted forward and set his clasped hands on the desk surface. "I want to be honest with you," he said, and after 26 years working undercover, I'd come to hear that particular sentence the way you hear a weapon being readied. "Please," I said. "What happened to Audra is a genuine tragedy. I understand it as a father, the pull to put a face on something terrible to make it mean something." He let a beat pass his face, a range in the space between concern and seriousness. "But I've been informed that certain materials have surfaced that touch on names within our family circle. I need you to understand those materials exist in a context. Taken in isolation without someone who grasps what's behind them, they read differently than they should." He held my eyes. Beatrice's name turning up in specific financial records, if it were misread, if it fell into the hands of people working without the full story, that could create real difficulties for everyone. He gave it a moment to settle. "I think what we all want is for Audra to heal," he went on. "A public fight that drags on doesn't serve her. It doesn't serve anyone. Someone with your background knows what it costs to let something like this get complicated." I held his gaze across that desk. The photographs, the flag, those hands folded just so, projecting nothing but patience. "I appreciate the directness," I said. "I'm always direct," he replied, the single most indirect statement he'd made all afternoon. I told him I would give his words serious thought. He rose, shook my hand a second time, and personally walked me to the door. A small gesture. It cost him nothing and told me everything about how confident he was that he'd gotten what he came for. South of Stockton, driving back down the 5, with the recorder sitting warm against my chest, I got Clyde on the line. "Got it," I said. Every word start to finish. Outside the windows, the valley rolled by, brown and vast and motionless. He brought up Beatrice by name, framed her as a complication, framed the whole thing as something that could be smoothed over if I played it quietly. Clyde didn't respond immediately. "That's not a direct threat," he said. "No," I said, "it isn't. But put it beside the NDA, the text sent to Beatrice, the 2 men posted outside my motel for a week, and the call his chief of staff placed to a city councilman the morning Audra was brought in. I let that sit a moment. Under 18 U.S.C. section 1512, witness tampering doesn't hinge on whether a threat was explicit. What matters is whether there was an attempt to influence, delay, or obstruct testimony or participation in a federal proceeding. He just characterized Beatrice's connection to federal documents as a problem that disappears if I keep things quiet. "In a recorded conversation," Clyde said, In a recorded conversation, I said, the remainder of the drive into Los Angeles passed with the sun hitting my windshield straight on the recorder in my pocket and the slow, unmistakable sensation of something that had been moving against me for a long time beginning to shift. Friday morning, Koreatown. Spread across the table between Clyde and me, printed summaries, financial flow diagrams, time-stamped screenshots, a USB drive sealed in an evidence bag that Clyde had labeled in his tight, even script. 8 days of accumulated work arranged in sequence the way you prepare a case before it passes out of your hands. Take me through it again, I said. Clyde moved along each item as he talked. Video evidence 4 minutes 12 seconds. Audra's recording 2 identifiable individuals with existing federal interest. Financial analysis $340 million across 11 LLCs, 6 years, 3 states. Ownership trail, Pacific Meridian Logistics, unwound through 4 layers, to a management address falling within Senator Fenner's zip code. Physical evidence, Long Beach container, 8 annual runs. Cargo manifests that made no economic sense. Identity fraud materials, Beatrice Hadley's SSN used without her knowledge or consent to establish 3 separate bank accounts. Recorded conversation, Sacramento. 11th September, Senator Fenner referencing Beatrice's name while discussing the management of complications. Clyde looked up. Witness tampering chain, the NDA, the text to Beatrice, the 2 men outside my motel for 8 days. The Sacramento recording, and Paloma Garza's documentation of Sandra. Whitfer's withdrawn complaint, a pattern end to end. He delivered it the way he delivered everything level so factual stripped of any performance. But what it amounted to had weight, and that weight was present on that table, as something almost tangible. It's enough, I said. More than enough, Clyde said. The only open question is whether it gets swallowed. That question never went away. Evidence routed to the wrong people vanishes. Evidence that finds the wrong entry point vanishes. 26 years of watching solid cases dissolve at the handoff, I carried that with me. This one wasn't going the same way. At 9:47 Friday morning, I sent the package encrypted digital submission to the FBI Financial Crimes Unit at the Los Angeles field office, a simultaneous submission to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, Western Region, anonymous, correctly structured, accompanied by a cover document breaking the evidence into 8 numbered sections, each one citing the applicable federal statutes at the top. The machine I used was a laptop Clyde had purchased in cash from a Best Buy in Glendale. Before it reached the FBI server, the submission was routed through 3 separate steps. Once it was through, Clyde shut the laptop. We sat with it for a moment, that specific feeling of having set something in motion that belongs to someone else now. Now we wait, Clyde said. Now we wait, I said. I headed to the hospital. Upstairs, Audra's numbers hadn't moved in the wrong direction. The attending physician said stable again, and by then I understood that stable was progress of its own kind, measured against what the other word would mean if anyone said it. I pulled the chair beside her bed and read aloud from a document I'd printed at the motel's business center, California, Title 24. Energy efficiency standards. The driest thing the state government had ever committed to paper, in the same even unhurried voice I'd been using for 8 days. The hours moved. I got coffee from the machine in the hall. Beatrice at 7, same as every night. Audra was stable, I told her. Beatrice said she was planning to take Cora to the park in the morning. Good, I said. 11 minutes on the phone about things that didn't seem to matter, and did. Then I went back to Koreatown and sat with it. Sunday evening, 14th of September. The prepaid rang. The caller identified themselves using a phrase I knew from 26 years back, internal shorthand, from a joint task force operation in 2011, the kind of language that exists only inside that operation and nowhere else. The FBI's method of establishing identity without stating it directly. We received your package, the voice said. Male mid-40s at a guess the professional flatness of someone accustomed to calls that carry this kind of freight. 2 of the subjects named in your submission, we've had eyes on them for 4 years. The network was mapped 3 layers in. We were missing the top. You have it now, I said. We do now, he said, a beat of silence. The financial documentation is clean. The Sacramento recording is admissible under federal one-party consent rules. The identity fraud element gives us a separate charging track. Another pause longer this time. Mr. Hadley, whatever steps you're planning to take over the next few weeks, make sure they hold up in a courtroom. They will, I said. Grand jury proceedings will get underway within 2 to 3 weeks, he said. Once that clock starts, things move quickly. People get anxious. Anxious people make decisions that create new problems. I understand, I said. He ended the call. I sat in the Koreatown motel room, holding the prepaid, looking at that curtain, with the parking lot light leaking through the gap at the edge, and I thought about 4 years. 4 years of watching Holt Drucker move money without being able to reach the hand behind it. 4 years of a case file that had every layer except the one at the top. Audra had found that layer in 4 minutes and 12 seconds through a door pushed open 2 inches. I set the phone on the nightstand and picked up the quarterly report I had been using as cover reading for a client back in Brooklyn. Opened to page 1. Then I went to the hospital and read it aloud to my daughter until visiting hours were over. On my way out, I nodded to the night nurse Odette, who had long since stopped wondering why a man read building codes and earnings reports to a woman who couldn't respond. I walked to my car in the parking structure and registered that the SUV was still there. Same position, same 2 men. Something settled in my chest, not quite relief, but close enough to recognize. The package was in. The grand jury was coming. 2 to 3 weeks. I could hold for 2 to 3 weeks. 8 days of patience was already behind me, and patience in my experience is not stillness. It is knowing precisely which move to make and precisely when to make it. I pulled out of the structure and drove back to Koreatown through the Sunday night Los Angeles traffic. I stopped at a place on Vermont that was still running and bought a sandwich and ate it in the motel parking lot. The SUV settled in 50 feet away. I sat there and thought about what came next. I knew something was going to shift on Monday night before it did. That SUV had held to a rigid pattern for 8 days, the same intervals, the same rotation, the same reporting cadence I had worked out by tracking the driver's side window and the timestamps on what Clyde could pull from their communication logs. Monday afternoon, the pattern broke. The intervals compressed. The 2 men stopped rotating out and stayed in the vehicle together. At 3:00 in the afternoon, one of them placed a call that ran 11 minutes, 9 minutes longer than anything they had made since Saturday. Someone had updated their orders. I reached Clyde at 4:00 tonight, I said. How certain enough. Get Paloma. I left the hospital at 10:00 the same way I'd left every night for 8 days, main entrance, left on San Vicente, south on Fairfax, east on Olympic toward Koreatown. The SUV picked me up on San Vicente, 2 cars back, exactly where it always positioned itself. The difference tonight was that Clyde was 4 cars behind the SUV, and Paloma Garza was in an unmarked Impala on the cross street at Fairfax and Olympic, engine running. Watching the intersection through a live feed from the small camera Clyde had fixed to the underside of my rental's rear bumper 48 hours earlier. They moved on me at the corner of Olympic and Hoover Street, a block and a half from the motel, close enough that they'd timed it to leave me with nowhere to go. The SUV accelerated and swung diagonally across the lane ahead of me, and a second car, a gray sedan, I hadn't logged yet, which told me they had brought in an additional vehicle, came up hard on my left and stopped alongside mine. The man who stepped out of the SUV's passenger side was broad mid-40s, wearing a jacket that didn't quite hide the shape of the weapon, holstered on his right hip. He came to my driver's window with the unhurried ease of someone who had done this before and fully expected it to resolve a certain way. I lowered the window. "Mr. Hadley," he said, not a question. "We need the tablet." "I don't have a tablet," I said. "Mr. Hadley." His voice dropped a half register, the specific shift from the polite form of a threat to the one that dispenses with politeness. "This doesn't have to be complicated." 40 feet behind him, I could see Clyde's rental sitting at the curb with its hazards blinking, presenting as a driver stopped to check his phone. And in my side mirror, Paloma's white headlights had turned onto Hoover Street and were closing at a pace that wasn't casual. "You're right," I said. "It doesn't." Paloma's light bar came on red and blue, strobing across the intersection. At the same instant, she hit the siren. A single hard burst that bounced off the building faces on both sides of Hoover Street and made the nature of the situation unmistakably clear. The large man's head turned. That was the mistake. The half-second gap that opens when your plan stops going the way you built it and your brain has to catch up to what's actually happening. By the time he turned back to my window, I was already out of the car, standing at full height, hands visible at my sides, and Paloma was moving fast from her vehicle with her badge raised. "LAPD. Don't move. Hands where I can see them." She had backup 2 units that had been staged a block north. They came around the corner 30 seconds after her light bar went on, which meant she had built this out more thoroughly than I'd requested. That told me something about Paloma Garza that I filed away. The large man from the SUV put his hands up. The second man from the gray sedan made a different call, one that didn't serve him. He tried to get back into the vehicle, and Paloma's backup unit was there before he had the door more than halfway open. Both men were in zip ties inside 4 minutes. Both vehicles secured. Both phones bagged as evidence, which was the piece that mattered most. I stood on the sidewalk on Hoover Street at 10:23 at night and watched Paloma direct her units with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been working toward this moment for 11 days, without once mentioning that was what she was doing. The Korean barbecue place across the street was still open. 2 men at a window table had stopped eating and were watching the police lights. Clyde pulled up beside me. The gray sedan was a rental, he said. Ran the plate while they were in motion. It's registered to a shell company that traces back to Ardan Security Solutions. Same firm, I said. Same firm, same client. He looked at the 2 men on the curb wrists, secured behind them. Their phones are going to be interesting. He was right about that. Clyde spent 2 hours that night with Paloma's digital forensics contact. What came off those phones wasn't complicated. 6 text messages between the large man and a contact stored as GP. Instructions to recover a tablet from Leonard Hadley by whatever means required. A follow-up confirming the approach. And a final message sent at 9:47 that evening. He leaves the hospital at 10:00. Don't come back without it. GP Gerald Paxton. The man who had sat across from me in the Ronald Reagan UCLA Medical Center waiting room, with his leather portfolio the color of dark charcoal, and his 3 office addresses, and his complete confidence that he had put the matter to rest, had just sent 6 text messages on an unencrypted phone directing 2 men to take property from a private citizen by force. Paloma called me at 1:00 in the morning from the division. Paxton's name is on 3 of the messages directly, she said. Her voice carried the flat energy of someone running on adrenaline and bad coffee. We have him on witness intimidation and conspiracy to commit robbery. He's going to need a lawyer considerably better than himself. Will he flip, I asked? A pause. In my experience, she said, men like Paxton flip the moment they grasp that personal loyalty to a client is not a defense to a felony. Give him 48 hours with a federal hold above his head, and he'll find a great deal of motivation to share what he knows. Good, I said. I hung up and lay back on the bed in the Koreatown motel room, staring at the ceiling. 8 days of being the most unremarkable man in Los Angeles. 8 days of flowers and cafeteria food and earnings reports read aloud to someone beyond hearing them. 8 days of letting that SUV sit outside and file its reports that everything was quiet. And now, Gerald Paxton, the man who had handed me an NDA with a gap in it wide enough to drive a federal investigation through, had used an unencrypted phone to order 2 men to strip evidence from a witness in a case tied to a sitting state senator. He hadn't handled the situation at all. He'd delivered it to me, neatly packaged with a chain of custody I hadn't needed to construct myself. I set the prepaid on the nightstand. I thought about calling Beatrice, but it was 1:00 in the morning, and she'd be asleep with Cora, and what I had to tell her could hold until morning, when I could say it clearly and completely, without the rawness that comes from standing on a sidewalk at 10:23 at night, watching something you've spent 8 days building finally irreversibly begin. I turned out the light. For the first time since September 5th, the parking lot outside my window sat empty. Clyde called at 5:40 Tuesday morning. It's done, he said. Both of them. I pushed myself upright on the motel bed. Both. Check your phone. He'd sent 2 photographs. The first was taken from a distance in low light. The front gate of the Fenner estate in Hancock Park. Raw iron. The security camera mounted on the left post was cycling through its scheduled maintenance window. According to a permit, filed 6 weeks earlier with the Los Angeles County Department of Building and Safety Public Record, the maintenance ran from 4:00 to 6:00 in the morning, Tuesday through Thursday, while the contractor completed the upgrade. In the photograph, a plain white envelope was visible on the ground just inside the gate. On the envelope's face, 4 words in block letters. You touched the wrong family. The second photograph stopped me cold. Gavin Fenner was seated at the base of the large oak tree in the motor court of his own estate, the one I had seen through the gate the morning I walked the property's perimeter a week ago. He was sitting with his back against the trunk, arms drawn behind him, not restrained with anything that would leave a mark, just held in the particular way that tells a person they are not going anywhere without making a decision about it. His wrists were zip-tied loosely in front of him, firm enough to hold, not firm enough to mark. He was in a t-shirt and pajama pants, bare feet. He was looking at something on the ground before him. The envelope. I studied that photograph for a long time. Clyde hadn't mentioned he was going to do this. I had told him I wanted the envelope delivered. He had decided on his own that the envelope alone wouldn't be sufficient, that a man like Gavin Fenner, who had moved through his entire life grasping consequences only when they were positioned directly in front of him and rendered impossible to sidestep, needed to understand something first. He needed to know that the people who had assembled the case against his family could reach him anywhere in his own motor court at 4 a.m. in his pajamas. I called Clyde back. How long, I asked. 40 minutes, he said, start to finish. 2 of his people. No one from the estate's detail saw anything. He was out on a walk. He goes out sometimes before the sun comes up. The night staff know it and don't trail him on the grounds. A pause. He wasn't hurt, Leonard. Not one mark. They held him there, left the envelope, and went out the same way they came in. And the envelope, he read it while he was sitting there. Clyde said that was the point. He had nowhere to move and nothing to do but read it. I turned that over. Gavin Fenner, seated against a tree trunk in his own motor court in the dark before sunrise, reading a photograph of his own face in a room he believed no one had ever seen, with 4 words he couldn't argue away, couldn't purchase his way out of, and couldn't put in front of a lawyer at 4 a.m. The camera, I asked. Maintenance window. Clyde said 40 minutes of gap in the exterior coverage. Everything inside the gate was dark. He paused. There is nothing on any recording that shows anything except 2 workers in contractor gear entering and leaving through the service access point during a scheduled maintenance window. Another pause. Which is in the permit. I got dressed and drove to the hospital. Senator Clifton Fenner called me at 6:13 in the morning from his personal cell phone. I was in the hospital parking structure engine, idling a gas station coffee gone cold in the cup holder. When the prepaid rang and I saw the California area code, I knew before I answered. A man with 22 years in the California State Senate calling a retired insurance consultant from Brooklyn on his personal cell phone at 6:00 in the morning. The structure he had spent 2 decades building was making sounds he had never heard from it, and the fear had gotten ahead of the discipline. "Who are you?" Senator Fenner said. Not Leonard, not the measured practice greeting from the office on L Street, just 3 words with everything stripped away, including the confidence that had always made him dangerous. I looked through the windshield at the concrete face of the parking structure wall and thought about Audra 4 floors above me, her machines, her numbers, the yellow flowers that had been fully open for 3 days now. "You don't need to know who I am, Senator," I said. My voice came out flat and level, the way it had come out in a great many rooms across a great many years. "You only need to know what your son did." Silence on his end, not the measured silence of a man choosing his words, but the silence of a man whose words had stopped coming altogether. "Whatever you think you have," he started. "I know what I have," I said, "and so do the people I sent it to." Another silence longer than the first. "Senator, don't call this number again," I said. I ended the call, set the phone on the passenger seat, lifted the coffee. Cold, tasted the way the parking structure smelled. I sat with it while the Los Angeles morning assembled itself around me, early cars, a delivery truck grinding up from the level below, pale flat light sliding in through the open sides of the structure. Senator Clifton Fenner had called me from his personal cell phone. The phone registered in his own name, carrying his personal number, the kind any first-year federal prosecutor could pull with a 2-page subpoena cross-referenced against the Sacramento recording, and Paxton's text messages and an NDA that didn't say what it was designed to say. He had done it because he was frightened, and frightened men with personal cell phones make the kind of decisions that become Exhibit A. I thought about Gavin seated against that oak tree at 4 in the morning, reading a photograph in the dark. I thought about what that moment must have felt like, sitting in his own motor court, in his pajamas, arms held behind him, no one coming, realizing that the man his family had written off as a retired nobody from Brooklyn had been inside his world for 3 weeks, had mapped it, had learned its rhythms, had walked the perimeter, Had known about the oak tree and the pre-dawn walks and the maintenance window and the 40-minute gap in the camera coverage. Had been in every sense that mattered most, the most consequential person on that property. Not because he could harm anyone, because he already held everything he needed. I got out of the car, bought yellow flowers from the corner stand on Wilshire, the same as every morning Audra's color since she was 7, and carried them upstairs and set them beside yesterday's in the thin vase the nurses had stopped asking about. I pulled the chair close to my daughter, opened the quarterly report to the page where I had left off, and out in the city, the pieces I had set in motion kept going. They knew where they were headed. The 3 weeks that followed were the quietest stretch of the whole thing, which is not the same as nothing happening. What happened was that the Fenner family began coming apart in the specific way organizations unravel when the people inside them stop trusting one another and start looking out for themselves. I watched it from a distance through Clyde, through Paloma, through the particular stillness of a parking lot that no longer held a black SUV. Clyde tracked the movement through the financial channels. The week after the envelope, Vance Capital started moving documents, digital transfers dressed up to resemble ordinary data housekeeping. They didn't resemble that at all because the FBI had been sitting on those servers from the moment the grand jury was convened. Each file that migrated got logged. Each transfer had a timestamp attached to it. Every effort to sanitize the record produced a fresh record of the sanitizing. "They're panicking," Clyde said to me on a Wednesday toward the end of September, parked at the table in the Koreatown room with his laptop and coffee that had stopped being warm sometime around noon. Yaj and I panicking. People believe they're making things disappear. What they're actually doing is writing a parallel ledger. Let them keep writing, I said. Third week of September, Paloma put in a formal internal affairs complaint against Captain Hollander, a documented report covering the phone call from Roy Cheswick, the sequence of events around the case reclassification, and her professional judgment that the reclassification rested on nothing investigatively sound. She did it on her own initiative without a word to me beforehand. I learned about it when she phoned to say it was filed. "You didn't have to do that," I told her. "Yes, I did," she said. The tone was the particular flatness of someone who has reasoned their way through to a position that no longer requires defending. Hollander's instruction was to handle it with sensitivity. I handled it, just not toward the end he had in mind. The IA investigation was open within 48 hours. Cheswick's name was in the filing. The campaign finance records Paloma had surfaced the fundraiser held at the Fenner estate. The guest list, a matter of public record, were included in the IA package as background. Sandra Whitver reached Paloma on the 1st of October. Paloma brought it to me that same night in the corridor outside Audra's room, while I stood holding a coffee I had neglected to drink. She said Sandra had been waiting. The way Paloma described it, her voice measured and deliberate, the voice she used when the subject was something personal, she was trying to pass along without distortion. It wasn't that she'd been waiting for this specifically, just waiting. She knew the pattern. She had lived long enough inside it to recognize that men like that don't quit, because you put distance between yourself and them. They quit when they're stopped by something they can't outmaneuver. Paloma paused. "She'll testify. She told me she's been prepared to for 3 years. She had just needed a door to open, something constricted in my throat. I turned and looked at the window set into Audra's door, the low light on the other side, the outline of my daughter behind the glass. 3 years. Sandra Whitver had taken a withdrawn complaint from the Wilshire Division all the way to Seattle, Washington, and held onto it for 3 years, waiting for someone to come along and ask in a way that made the answer worth giving. My daughter had pushed through a door left open 2 inches and handed that person a reason to ask. "Tell her thank you," I said. The words came out with more roughness than I had intended. "I will," Paloma said. October 6th, the first intermediary went to the FBI. Clyde called me with the news. I was at my regular table in the cafeteria, same chair, same bad coffee. He said it plainly. One of the LLC managers walked into the field office on Wilshire this morning with an attorney. They want to discuss cooperation terms. I put the coffee down. "Which one?" "The Delaware entity, the one tied to Long Beach." He let a beat pass. "Leonard, once the first one moves, you don't have to push the rest. They find their own way to the door. Nobody holds on when the ceiling is coming down." He was right. Inside the next 10 days, 2 additional intermediaries made contact through counsel. Each showed up with documents. Each showed up carrying information the Bureau hadn't had before. Each of them showed up because sitting and waiting, watching the individuals above them scramble while the case against them deepened and the grand jury ground forward had become the more dangerous position. The machinery was self-sustaining at that point. I moved through those weeks as I had moved through every week since September 5th. At the hospital, in the mornings, at the hospital in the evenings, the time in between spent on whatever still required doing. Yellow flowers from the corner stand each morning. Quarterly reports building codes. California Title 24, read aloud in a steady, unhurried voice to a woman who gave no sign of hearing them, because it was the only offering I had that might carry through to wherever she'd gone. October 17th, a Friday. 5 weeks and 5 days from the night, the world changed. Dr. Ozzie caught me in the hallway just outside Audra's room. Her face held the particular expression she reserved for news that hadn't yet resolved into either category. Not the expression for bad news, and not quite the one for good news. The measured, guarded look of a physician who has come to understand that hope mishandled is its own form of harm. Her responses to external stimuli have climbed significantly in the past 72 hours, Dr. Ozzie said. She's following faces through the window. Pressure readings have held stable across 9 straight days. She stopped. I'm not saying she wakes up tomorrow. I'm saying the trajectory is faster than I projected. Something moved in my chest standing there in that hallway. Not the cold that had taken root on September 5th. Something with heat in it and more weight than the cold. Because when you've spent long enough inside, fear-hope lands harder than the fear did. What does that translate to practically? I asked. It means you keep showing up, she said. Keep doing what you're doing when you're in that room. Keep talking to her. She held my eyes for a moment. I've watched families let go of a patient, and I've watched families who won't. The ones who have someone present in that room every day talking, reading, just being there, their numbers diverge from the others. I have no clean explanation for why. I'm only telling you what I've observed. She turned and walked back toward the nursing station. I stayed where I was for a moment, then stepped back into the room, settled into the chair beside Audra, and started the quarterly report again from page 1. That evening, getting coffee from the cafeteria television at 7, a news segment led with a brief item: federal investigators had paid a visit to Vance Capital's downtown Los Angeles offices. The piece ran 40 seconds. A company spokesperson offered that they were cooperating fully with all relevant inquiries. The anchor pivoted to the next story. Clyde phoned while I was still watching the screen. "Grand jury's moving," he said. U.S. Attorney's Office has confirmed proceedings are active. No word on an indictment timeline, but they have momentum. The anchor on the television had moved on to a drought report out of the Central Valley. "Clyde," I said. "Yeah." "Audra's responding to stimuli. Dr. Osei says the numbers are trending the right direction." Silence on his end. Not the silence that means nothing to say the other kind, where a man who has been holding something at arm's length allows it to get close for a second. "Good," Clyde said, quieter than his usual register. "That's good, Leonard." I drained the coffee, went back up to the floor, sat with Audra, and stayed until the nurse came to end visiting hours. Driving back to the Koreatown motel that night, for the first time in 37 days, the weight that had occupied my chest every night since September 5th was still there. It was just not as heavy as it had been. I was at the cafeteria table at 8:47 on the morning of Tuesday, October 21st, when Clyde called. "Put the news on," he said. The TV bolted to the cafeteria wall was showing a Los Angeles traffic segment. I asked the woman at the counter if she could find a news channel. She could. I took up a position at the far end of the counter with my coffee and watched. The ticker running along the bottom of the screen said FBI raids Vance Capital offices downtown LA. The camera was on the South Figueroa building, glass 32 floors, the architectural vocabulary of permanent power, with 3 black bureau vehicles angled up to the entrance and agents in blue windbreakers crossing the lobby behind the reporter. She was on the sidewalk talking fast into her microphone. I raised my phone volume and held it against the TV speaker. Federal search warrant, financial crimes investigation, no statement yet from the company. I stood there with my coffee and watched the footage run on repeat. Clyde rang again at 9:20. "Long Beach," he said. "Pacific Meridian Logistics. The vessel is being held at berth. IRS criminal investigation has people on the dock." A beat of silence. "The Cayman accounts are frozen. DOJ filing landed this morning. Asset freeze covering all 11 LLCs. 11 companies. $340 million, 6 years. I put the coffee down and went upstairs to the fourth floor. Audra's room looked the way it had looked every morning for 46 days. The machines, the numbers, the flowers in the thin vase. Yesterday I'd swapped out the old ones for fresh because they had finally given up. I took the chair beside her and studied her face and turned over the image of a 23-story glass building on South Figueroa, with federal agents crossing the lobby and $340 million worth of reasons for their being there. At 11's used storage, Gerald Paxton's cooperation agreement entered the public record. Clyde forwarded me the filing summary. Paxton had delivered 4 days of testimony to the U.S. Attorney's Office across the 2 weeks prior. Testimony the filing characterized as substantial and corroborated. Among what he had provided documentation, establishing that Senator Clifton Fenner had personally directed the use of Beatrice Hadley's personal information to set up the 3 Delaware LLCs, not Gavin, the senator himself. The instruction had originated at the top, put in writing in an internal communication that Paxton had held onto the kind of document a careful attorney keeps, because careful attorneys understand that loyalty has an expiration date and preparation does not. Senator Fenner had deployed Beatrice's name as an instrument, and the man entrusted with wielding it had turned it over to the federal government in exchange for a reduced charge and the preservation of his law license. Clyde called at noon. His voice carried the specific quiet of someone who has been holding a piece of news for a while before delivering it. DOJ issued a formal statement this morning. He said, Beatrice Hadley has been confirmed as a non-involved party. Her name is being pulled from all investigative filings. No charges, no further inquiry. I was beside Audra when he said it. The quarterly report was open across my knee, but I had stopped reading several pages back and was just sitting the way you sit when you've been running hard for a long time, and things have slowed enough that you can finally register the stillness. Thank you, Clyde, I said. Don't thank me, he said. She didn't do anything wrong. The paperwork just needed time to acknowledge that. At 2 in the afternoon, Holt Drucker was taken into custody at LAX. He was holding a one-way ticket to Singapore on a departure scheduled for 4:15. Federal agents intercepted him at the gate. The arrest was over in 40 seconds, a detail from the arresting agent's report, which Clyde pulled through a contact the following day. Drucker didn't resist. He took the seat they directed him to, placed his hands on his knees, and sat waiting, the posture of a man who had understood for some time that this moment was coming and had been gambling on his ability to beat the clock. He had not beaten the clock. Bo Kellum surrendered to the FBI field office in Chicago 2 days later, Thursday the 23rd. Attorney at his side, a cooperation proffer already drafted and in hand. The agent who processed the surrender described him as cooperative in detailed federal language that translates to he had considerable information to share and had taken the time to organize it before walking through the door. Senator Clifton Fenner's resignation letter went out at 9 in the morning on Thursday the 23rd of October on official California State Senate letterhead. It ran 4 sentences. It cited personal and family reasons. It made no reference to the federal investigation, the grand jury, his family's former attorney's cooperation agreement, or the $340 million routed through 11 companies over 6 years. It thanked the people of California for the privilege of service. 22 years, 4 sentences. I read it on my phone at the cafeteria table and felt nothing in particular, which told me something about what I had actually come here for and what I hadn't. Clyde called again at noon on Thursday. Beatrice is clear, he said the second time he'd said it, because some things warrant saying twice. I know, I told him. I'm going to phone her tonight. How is she holding up? Better than she admits, I said. Same as she always has. Thursday evening, the 23rd. 48 days passes September 5th. I was in the chair beside Audra in the late afternoon light that filtered through her window when the sun fell below the building across the street and turned the whole room a deep amber shade. I had come to think of that light as hers, belonging to this room, this hour, this particular shape of waiting. When Dr. Osei walked in, she didn't speak right away. She went to the monitors, logged a notation on her tablet, and stood looking at Audra for a long moment with the expression of someone who had given 12 years to this work and still found it capable of catching her off guard. Then she turned to me. Her responsiveness scores have climbed 22% over the past week, she said. Intracranial pressure has held within normal range for 11 consecutive days. The edema has resolved almost entirely. She paused. Mr. Hadley, I want to be precise about what I'm about to say because I've seen patients reach this point and level off, and I don't want to build an expectation the data can't yet support. Another pause. But if you ask me today whether I believe your daughter is going to wake up, I would tell you that I believe she is going to wake up. My jaw locked, my eyes burned. I pressed both palms flat against my knees and breathed through it slowly, the same way I had been breathing through things for the past 48 days. I didn't speak for a moment, because nothing I could have said would have been equal to what was happening inside my chest. When I asked the question, when she said, "I don't know," it could be days, it could stretch longer. The brain keeps its own calendar. She tucked the tablet under her arm. "Keep doing what you're doing, keep reading to her, keep showing up." She left. I sat in the amber light with the quarterly report closed on my knee and Audra's hand beneath mine, her fingers marginally warmer than they'd been the day before. Or perhaps that was projection. Perhaps warmth was something I was reading into data that hadn't earned it yet. I thought about what Dr. Osei had said. She is going to wake up. I lifted the quarterly report and opened it to page 1, the same page I had started from every night for 48 days, the same even unhurried cadence she had known her whole life, the voice that could still reach her, even now, even here. I cleared my throat and read. They brought Gavin out at 6:31 in the morning. I was parked half a block from the Hancock Park gate engine, off hands in my lap, watching through the windshield. I hadn't planned to be there, but certain things you need to take in with your own eyes rather than learn about later through a filing summary. In handcuffs, Gavin Fenner looked smaller than I recalled, not in any physical sense, but diminished the way a person diminishes when everything propping them up is suddenly gone. The estate, the security detail, the senator for a father, the fitted dress shirts, the motor court, the $6 million assessed value, all of it stripped away. What remained was a 36-year-old man in a gray t-shirt walking toward a federal vehicle with his wrists bound behind him. Paloma was at the gate. She caught my eye and gave a single nod. Gavin saw me too. He pulled up for just a half step and looked at me with the expression of a man whose grasp of events is reorganizing itself in real time, and the picture that's forming isn't one he recognizes. I reached inside my jacket and produced the badge. NYPD retired. I held it up for 3 seconds and put it away. His jaw tightened. Whatever had always been his instrument, the ease, the warmth, the finely tuned confidence of a man who had never once found himself on the wrong side of a room, was gone from his voice entirely. "You were undercover this whole time," he said. I looked at him. I thought about Audra at the bottom of a staircase. I thought about a 911 call and 2 words she fell. I thought about Beatrice's name on 3 documents she had never agreed to sign, and an 8-year-old girl standing in a hospital waiting room at 1:00 in the morning with her shoes on the wrong feet, holding a tablet out in both hands. "No," I said. "I was just her father. They put him in the vehicle. I watched the convoy roll out through the gate and vanish from view. Then I drove to the hospital. Stopped at the corner stand on Wilshire for yellow flowers. The man there had long since stopped asking what the occasion was, and took them up to the 4th floor. The new flowers went in beside yesterday's. I opened the quarterly report, found page 1, and started reading that steady, unhurried tone. I've always used the same one Audra used to fall asleep to, when she was 9, stretched out on the floor of my Brooklyn apartment, while a tape recorder sat disassembled between us. 20 minutes went by, then I stopped. 49 days had trained me to read that room the way I'd spent a lifetime reading every room I'd walked into. The numbers, the rhythms, what each line on each monitor was supposed to look like, and what it didn't. Something was off. I knew it before I could say what. Audra's right hand shifted against the blanket. Her fingers drew in, then released, went motionless. My heart was going so hard the feeling reached my back teeth. I held my breath, leaned closer. The fingers drew in again. Audra. The name scraped out of me barely a whisper. "Hey, I'm right here." Her eyelids lifted in slow stages the way they do when the mind behind them is laboring over something that once required no effort at all. Ceiling first, then the window, then the hardest turn of all me. Whatever she was searching for came back gradually, not all at once. Her lips parted silently, then again. "Did Cora give you the tablet, rough and dry, that voice, and still the greatest sound to reach my ears in 58 years? My throat stopped working entirely. I had to tip my head back, pull air in through my nose, and hold it there before words were possible. "She did," I managed. Audra's eyes drifted shut for a moment. When they came back open, something in her face had released the way a person looks when they've been gripping a single fear for far too long, and someone has finally told them they can let go. "Good girl," she whispered. "So then what did you do, Dad?" I wrapped both hands around hers gently, the grip you use for something that nearly slipped away for good. "I did what fathers do," I told him. The door swung open, small feet on linoleum, brisk and purposeful, the sound of someone who'd already waited past the point of patience. Cora rounded the foot of the bed and pulled up short the instant she saw her mother's eyes looking back at her. Both hands pressed over her mouth. Tears came before she had any chance of stopping them. Then, moving with the deliberate care of an 8-year-old who does not want to cause harm, she climbed up and tucked herself in beside Audra, her head finding her mother's shoulder. "Hi, Mommy." She said the words half swallowed by tears and fabric. Audra's arm lifted slow and heavy and drew her close. "Hi, baby." Beatrice stepped in behind Cora. She made it as far as the doorway before stopping, and the sound that left her, I won't reach for a description. It was the sound a particular kind of long-suffering makes when it finally ends. She moved to the bed, gathered Audra's free hand in both of hers, and held it to her own face. And the shaking in her shoulders was something she had no interest in hiding. I got to my feet, crossed to the window, and set one open palm against the glass. Cold went straight through it. Back behind me, Cora's voice, Beatrice's crying, Audra speaking in a low, unhurried murmur that belonged to them and not to me. That was right. That was how it was supposed to be. 26 years had made me skilled at the quiet exit, at withdrawing from rooms so smoothly that the room itself didn't register the change. But some rooms once entered don't release you. Remaining is the whole job. Audra said my name. I turned. She was watching me from the bed, Cora nestled against her, Beatrice at her hand, working at a smile that wasn't quite there, though there was no mistaking what she was reaching for. "Thank you," she said. "You did the hard part," I told her. Audra opened her eyes, and the first thing she did before anything else was confirm that every step I had taken was the one she had asked me to take. That was enough. This road cost more than I had a right to spend. 58 days of watching monitors, reading rooms, and holding myself together by procedure alone when everything underneath was coming apart. But I believe God keeps a careful account of what is done to the innocent, and that His timing, not ours, is what finally breaks things open. The truth did not arrive quickly. It arrived completely. For anyone walking through something like this, and I know some of you are here, is what I took from it. Document everything from the first moment something feels wrong. Evidence gathered quietly is the only kind that holds. If someone you love is in danger, do not wait for permission to act. Patience is a strategy, not an excuse to stand still. When powerful people try to manage you by managing the people around you, the answer is to make yourself impossible to manage. And protect your family's name as if it is the only asset that cannot be replaced, because it is. This is the kind of family revenge story that doesn't end with a courtroom scene or a headline. It ends with a woman opening her eyes and a daughter climbing up beside her. That is what all of it was for. If you are in the adults 50-plus chapter of your life, you already know some fights are not about winning. They are about who you refuse to let be erased. If this story reached you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read them. And if you want to stay close to stories like this, subscribe to Honor Revenge Stories. I'll be here. Thank you for listening all the way through. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other.